At first blush, this talk may seem out of sequence. For the last 3 sessions, we've been discussing mindfulness and meditation. In this lecture, however, we're turning, rather precipitously it might seem, to the subject of moral behavior. Yet the turn to morality is not as odd as it might appear at first. There is an essential and intrinsic relationship between personal conduct and the practice of mindfulness. The religious and philosophical traditions that promote mindfulness are fully aware of this connection and foreground its significance in the discipline. Many of the psychological and medical approaches to mindfulness, though, tend to downplay it. However, to some extent, all mindfulness perspectives recognize that meditation must be practiced within the wider context of one's life, and that context necessarily involves the dimension of human experience we call ethical. The religious and philosophical traditions insist that this larger context must be set in order before one attempts to delve deeper into mindfulness meditation. The reasoning is simple. It's not possible to compartmentalize the various aspects of our lives. Our physical, mental, ethical, and spiritual dimensions are all interrelated. We are holistic beings. A disordered ethical life will disrupt our efforts to practice meditation. How can one attain tranquility and clarity of mind if one's behavior weighs heavily on the conscience? This does not mean, however, that you must be a morally perfect individual before you can start to meditate. Since all aspects of our lives are interconnected, mindfulness practice will enable us to be morally better persons. Yet it is important that certain kinds of behavior be curtailed, if necessary, before one attempts the more demanding practice of meditation. The mindfulness approach to matters of personal ethics differs from moral perspectives that are governed by rules. Unlike ethical systems based on obedience to specific regulations, such as the 10 Commandments, the practices governing ethical conduct in the mindfulness tradition are centrally concerned with shaping personal character. The precepts associated with mindfulness practice are put forth as tools for refining the personal qualities that enable us to become wiser and more compassionate, the principal virtues in this tradition. These precepts are not regarded as rules sent down from on high. No one is threatened with divine punishment for failing to observe them. Instead, they are presented as practices that are in our nature and best interest to follow. Observing these precepts is considered essential to sharpening the skills of mindfulness, and hence to eliminating suffering and fostering happiness. The particular formulation of these principles that we'll use for this course come from the teachings of the Buddha. But the principles are not uniquely Buddhist. In fact, most of them are included in almost all ethical perspectives, religious and secular. What distinguishes the Buddhist articulation is the way they are presented as aspirations rather than as commands or laws. Each of these precepts is formulated as a promise that one makes to behave in a specific way. If one fails to fulfill that promise, he or she simply takes note of the shortcoming and vows to do better on the next occasion. No moral guilt is incurred for falling short of the promise, although one will inevitably have to face any personal or legal consequences of so doing. Gradually, by resolving to start afresh each time one falls short, the skill to follow the precepts becomes increasingly stronger, to the point where acting otherwise becomes unthinkable. This particular way of approaching ethical conduct is especially valuable for promoting mindfulness. It invites individuals to act morally, not to avoid punishment, but for the more positive purpose of refining one's character and promoting the well-being of the world. Attending to one's actions for this reason helps one recognize how wholesome actions condition a wholesome mind, promoting a greater sense of responsibility for the quality of our personality. When we fall short of our aspirations, we don't need to carry around a sense of guilt that serves no good purpose. We simply relinquish our mistake and try again. This pattern of observing and letting go is the basic dynamic of mindfulness. Thus, in attending to our conduct, we aren't only cultivating an appropriate context for mindfulness, we're actually practicing mindfulness as we do so. The Buddha taught a great number of ethical aspirations to his followers, but we need only concern ourselves with 5, the foundational precepts of them all. In the manner in which they are most frequently stated, the 5 aspirations are these: I will endeavor not to harm sentient beings. I will endeavor not to steal. I will endeavor not to misuse sexuality. I will endeavor not to use false speech. I will endeavor not to consume toxins. These promises are all related to the principle of not harming, a notion that resounds throughout the world's philosophical and ethical traditions. We'll discuss each of these precepts in turn to examine how they are connected to the practice of harmlessness, as well as to the practice of mindfulness. There are many good reasons to refrain from harming sentient beings, that is, beings that can feel pain and pleasure. From a metaphysical perspective, one might argue that doing harm is a violation of our own innate nature, or that it defies the dignity and inherent worth of others. To hurt others, therefore, goes against the grain of who we truly are. More pragmatically, one could say that not harming others minimizes the chances that we ourselves will be harmed, since people have a tendency to retaliate against those who hurt them. These are excellent and perhaps sufficient reasons to cultivate a practice of harmlessness. The mindfulness practice, however, offers additional incentives. Striving not to cause harm helps us to be more mindful. Deliberately hurting others has a profound effect on our state of mind. Generally, the intention to harm arises from anger, hatred, or fear. When we act on that intention, we reinforce the emotion that underlies it, thus increasing the likelihood that the emotion will arise again. When our minds are flooded with anger, hatred, and fear, we lose our capacity to see things clearly, and we often make poor choices. Causing harm to others thus causes harm to us. By refusing to inflict injury when such negative emotions occur, we are given an opportunity to seek other, more constructive and skillful ways to respond to them. Later in the series, We'll discuss specific techniques for handling these situations without resorting to the conditioned impulse to hurt others or ourselves. Not all harm we cause, however, is intentional. We often hurt others simply by being thoughtless. Sometimes we say things without regard for how our words might affect another. Consider how many car accidents occur because people simply do not pay sufficient attention to their driving. Think about how many bugs you squash just walking across the sidewalk. Or reflect on the size of your carbon footprint. To vow not to harm is a promise to be more aware of our actions and words and their effects on others. It is an intention to be more mindful and to refuse to revert to the mindless state where selfishness rules. When we consider the unintended harm we may cause, fulfilling the first mindfulness precept seems well nigh impossible. It is certainly difficult to go through life without hurting someone or something. The value of the precept, however, lies not in performing it perfectly, which we may never do, but in the objective to become more fully aware of ourselves and to create a peaceful mind that minimizes the damage we cause and promotes a clearer perception of reality and our place in it. It awakens within us what Albert Schweitzer called a reverence for life, an awe and respect for all living things and for life itself. The promise not to steal follows what is a universal moral principle. I can think of no ethical system that condones stealing, except in the rarest of cases. Proscribing stealing is an absolute necessity for the sustainability of any society. Like the precept of non-harming, the principle of non-stealing can be justified in any number of ways, but it has special meaning for those who wish to become more mindful. Whereas the intention to harm arises out of anger, hatred, and fear, stealing is usually motivated by greed and envy. Acting on these negative states tends to reinforce them, conditioning the mind in such a way that greed and envy crop up at the slightest provocation. Like anger, hatred, and fear, greed and envy are disruptive to the mental serenity that mindfulness needs and intends to develop. Stealing, however, need not be prompted by greed or envy. In the Confessions, St. Augustine relates a fascinating story from his childhood in which he and a bunch of youthful companions stole pears from a neighbor's orchard. Augustine himself was initially perplexed about what inspired this theft. He wasn't hungry and didn't need or even want the pears. In fact, he had better pears at home. He wasn't even intending to cause harm to the owner of the orchard. After reflection, Augustine concluded that the primary drive behind the act was the pure thrill of doing wrong. He did it for the hell of it. His profound insight displays the great complexity and subtlety of the mind. So often, the motives underlying our deeds are simply unknown to us. But Augustine's depth of understanding allowed him to recognize that beneath this puzzling act was his own ego, a sense of self craving to feel the pleasure of a power that Augustine believed only belong to God. One need not subscribe to Augustine's theism to appreciate his insight. Lurking behind so much of what we do is a self that wants godlike powers, to be at the center of the universe, to exert control over reality, to feel unconstrained by anything. The problem is that for finite beings like us, these desires are not only unrealistic, they lead to behaviors that thwart our happiness and cause misery to others. The vow to try not to steal thus serves to recondition the impulses that ultimately cause us great harm. Stealing, of course, need not be defined merely as the taking of material things like pears. Probably most of us don't steal cars or television sets, although we might pilfer a few office supplies from work or sample the occasional strawberry in the grocery store. If we do take material goods, they're probably of the minor sort that allows us to rationalize the act with comparative ease. The more insidious forms of theft, however, are of the abstract variety, the kinds of things that are less tangible. Such things as taking credit for another person's ideas, illegally downloading music or software from the internet, or failing to speak up when the checkout cashier makes an error in our favor. Because we live in a materialistic culture, these types of stealing often seem less real or less severe than stealing tangible objects. We might not consider them stealing at all. From the perspective of mindfulness, there's little difference between the kinds of things one steals. The effect is the same. Taking what does not belong to us strengthens a sense of self that is unwholesome and obstructs the clarity that mindfulness practice seeks to develop. On the other hand, the promise not to steal signals our intention to restrain greed and envy and commits us to a practice of honesty, especially when we think we have the opportunity to get away scot-free. In mindfulness practice, however, there is no getting away scot-free. Every act leaves its mark on our character, and the small things we do or do not do add up. The Buddha admonished his followers, "Do not think lightly of evil, saying, 'It will not come to me.' For drop by drop, a water jar is filled. The fool fills himself with evil, soaking it up little by little." But the same is true with the cultivation of a good character. The Buddha also said, "Do not think lightly of goodness, saying, 'It will not come to me.' For drop by drop, a water jar is filled. The sage fills himself with goodness, soaking it up little by little." Like stealing, the principle of not misusing sexuality is a near universal ethical standard, and with good reason. The abuse of sexuality causes tremendous destruction to individual lives and threatens the stability of human social life. The point is so patent that it requires no further commentary from me. What does bear analysis, however, is the significance of this precept in mindfulness practice. Let's begin with what is meant by the expression misuse of sexuality. Although the proscription of abusing sexuality is a universal or near universal principle, the concrete meaning of that principle often varies from culture to culture. In some communities, premarital sex is wrong. In others, it is acceptable and even expected. The vagueness of the mindfulness precept is deliberate and, I think, constructive. Simply vowing not to misuse sexuality rather than promising to act on specific rules ultimately implies that we must take responsibility for our own sexual ethic. What constitutes misuse may vary from situation to situation, and it's up to us to determine what that might mean concretely. Because we're ultimately responsible in these situations, we must remain keenly attentive to our thoughts, words, and deeds, and act in a manner that refrains from harming others and ourselves, the principal guideline we must use. The misuse of sexuality can be an especially powerful threat to mindfulness. As our own culture amply shows, sexuality can easily become an obsession that renders us mindless. In fact, much of Western commerce counts on the mindlessness of sexual obsession to persuade us to buy products and services that we really don't need. Even more serious are all the things a sexually obsessed individual might be willing to do to satisfy his or her lust. The list includes the violation of every conceivable ethical principle: lying, stealing, cheating, and even murder. Deeper still is the effect of a disordered sexuality on the mind. Once again, my favorite Christian saint, Augustine, provides a compelling example. Augustine has been called the most famous sex addict in history. If you've read his Confessions, you'll understand why. Like his theft of the pears, Augustine sought to understand his sexual debauchery as a young man. Again, his insight was profound. According to the later celibate Augustine, his youthful lust was love gone awry. What really motivated Augustine's sexual exploits, he concluded, was the thoroughly wholesome desire to love and be loved. Yet because he was unable to see that clearly, because we might say he was mindless, Augustine came to believe that copious sex would satisfy this deeper longing, a yearning he really didn't understand. We can say that Augustine was, in the words of the immortal country and western song, looking for love in all the wrong places. Through years of agony, Augustine eventually discovered what he was really seeking could only be found in God. Again, you don't have to accept Augustine's theology to appreciate his insight into the human condition. We spend so much of our lives looking for something that will make us happy, only to find that nothing provides it. The desire for happiness is wholesome, but our quest is misguided because of our distorted ideas about what will give us the satisfaction we crave. The promise not to misuse sexuality, then, can be understood as a principle for keeping us on the right track. There is no happiness in disordered sexual behavior. In some of my courses, I assign students a simple task to acquaint them with the practice of abstaining from false speech. False speech is lying, gossiping, and slander, cursing and harsh language, and idle chatter, or frivolous talk with no constructive purpose. I ask my students to go an entire day trying to avoid these forms of false speech and to be attentive to the times they slip. The assignment is made along with some other ascetical practices, but students usually find this one the hardest. I understand why. It's also the hardest for me. The author of the book of James in the New Testament tells us, every species of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by the human species, but no one can tame the tongue, a restless evil full of deadly poison. A bit of poetic hyperbole, perhaps, but who can deny the power of our words to cause tremendous harm and the difficulty of keeping our words under control? The real challenge of observing this precept is to be aware of when we use false speech. As my students discover, we are so conditioned to this kind of behavior that we're usually oblivious when our tongues go astray until after the fact. And even then, some of us remain totally unaware of the effects of our language. In view of the damage caused by our mindless words and the attentiveness required to keep them in check, the significance of the promise to watch our language for mindfulness practice ought to be apparent. Its importance is so great, in fact, that we will devote an entire discussion later in the course to the practice of mindful speech. In the meantime, I invite you to make a deliberate effort to watch the patterns of your words for a single day. Historically, the precept to refrain from consuming toxins referred specifically to the use of alcohol, or stupefying drink, as it was then called. The intent of this principle was simply to diminish the destructive effects of drunkenness and to foster the clarity of mind necessary for practicing mindfulness. The use of alcohol can obviously affect the ability to be attentive and think clearly. But alcohol isn't the only substance that stupefies the mind, of course. Adhering to the spirit of this precept would necessarily mean becoming aware of any substance that could impair our mental and bodily functions, such as tobacco and mind-altering drugs. In short, promising to observe this precept means nothing less than trying to stay as physically healthy and as mentally sharp as possible by keeping a close eye on the things we allow into our bodies and into our minds. Today, guarding our minds from intoxication would necessarily include being mindful about the kinds of information we take in. Since he did not live in the age of Twitter, Facebook, and cable TV, the Buddha did not anticipate the potentially deleterious effects of being exposed to as much information as we moderns are. Yet surely the amount and quality of data that we permit into our heads shapes the character of our minds. Feeding our minds a steady diet of pointless and trivial information can dull the mind as much as other intoxicants. And like stupefying substances, we can become addicted to media stimulation. In the same assignment I give my students for refraining from false speech, I ask them to spend another day fasting from media. That is, going 24 hours without reading a paper or a magazine, listening to music, watching TV, going to a movie, playing video games, or using the internet or cell phones, except in an emergency. Their responses to the assignment are quite revealing. Many of them find the experiment to be refreshing. They discover how much time they usually waste in meaningless activities and how more aware they are of their world and inner experience when their minds are not cluttered with inessential information. They find that they have more time in the day than they realized. Others find the media fast to be very difficult to endure. They report irritability and a sense of aimlessness, the kinds of things one might experience trying to quit an addiction cold turkey. Those who find the fast refreshing and those who find it irritating both attest to the way heavy reliance on media stimulation can detract from mindfulness. There's a great deal more that can be said about these 5 precepts and their importance in the practice of mindfulness. As we proceed through the course, we'll have more opportunities to discuss them. At this point, though, I merely want to invite you to conduct a moral inventory in the spirit of these 5 aspirations. Set aside some time and honestly look at the way you conduct your life. Consider whether any of these behaviors in these 5 areas, harming others, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, and intoxication, might in some way impede your attentiveness to your experience and jeopardize your happiness. You'll find this exercise more meaningful if you write down your reflections. To help with this inventory, consider taking a media fast and practicing a day of refraining from false speech. These exercises will assist in bringing these aspects of your life into greater awareness. If your reflections reveal that your conduct falls short of what you think it ought to be, consider taking these 5 vows, or whichever ones you find relevant. If you choose to do so, you will find them easier to observe if you recite them each day. In our next session, we'll begin to discuss the practice of sitting meditation. I'll see you then.